or at least some of the assumptions I'm going to make. First of all, that I assume that most scientists are saying the following, and that what they're saying is correct. First, no one is entirely safe from COVID until COVID has been eradicated to a similar extent to which smallpox has been eradicated. Second, by far the most effective way of eradicating COVID is for everyone to be vaccinated who can survive vaccination. Third, only a small minority of people are more endangered by the vaccine than by catching COVID. Fourth, anyone who does not have COVID antibodies can catch COVID and spread it to other people in familiar ways. And fifth, the surest way of making sure someone does have the COVID antibodies is for that person to have a vaccination against COVID. Next slide, please. Now, you might disagree with one or more of my reports about what most scientists say, or you might agree with my reports about what... Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Sorry, I've lost you. Sorry, I'm sorry. You might disagree with one or more of my reports about what most scientists say, or you might agree with my reports about what most scientists say, but disagree with the scientists. Now, those are matters for you to debate with someone whose expertise is in biology or medicine or public health policy, but not with me. For today's discussion, I'm taking as given that I've reported accurately what most scientists say and that they are correct. Next slide, please. Now, the UK government has strongly urged everyone to whom the NHS offers a vaccination to take up the offer. The NHS aims to avoid offering the vaccination to people who are too frail or too prone to allergic reactions for this vaccination to be safe. But various people are refusing the offer of a vaccination. In the face of such refusals, many organizations are considering making vaccinations mandatory for anyone who works in the organization and perhaps for others who come into physical contact with people while they're at work for the organization. Now, I need to add a qualification here. I take it that organizations wouldn't be considering making mandatory people who work from home. What they're considering is making mandatory vaccinations for people who come into the workplace, so to speak, and interact physically with or in the same physical space as other employees or customers or suppliers, etc. So people who work from home are kind of left out of this discussion. Who work exclusively from home are left out of this discussion. I'm sorry about that. The ethics of mandatory vaccinations is my topic. As I said, I leave to Emma the legal questions and the HR questions. Now, some people refuse the offer of a vaccination because they think having a vaccination is not in their own best interests. Some people think they've already had the virus and so have immunity. And some people think they're too young and fit to be endangered by getting the virus. And some people think the government cannot be trusted when it says that getting vaccinated is in your own best interest. Actually, I think I know people in each of these categories. I know some people in each of these categories. So this is not just imaginary. I bet you do too. Next slide, please. Now, I think, I don't think this is going to be controversial. I hope this is going to be controversial. We are not always the best protectors of our own good or our own best interests. I mean, perhaps we usually are, but not always. My employer might be saving my life by mandating that I get a vaccine, though I'm not either persuaded the vaccine is safe or too scared of needles to go willingly to get one. So I guess I think that a degree of paternalism is justified, at least in some cases, in the interest of preserving people's health. And that's the justification really for making motorcycle helmets mandatory, making wearing seatbelts in cars mandatory, making pension schemes mandatory. Nevertheless, I think only limited paternalism is justified. Morality demands that we respect other people's autonomy. And the strength of this demand is such that society should presume that adults get to choose what they think is best for themselves. Because of the importance of autonomy, I myself would be against mandatory vaccination if the only rationale for mandatory vaccination were the protection of the health of the person to be vaccinated. But even if you would somehow not be benefited by getting vaccinated, other people might be benefited by your getting vaccinated. Maybe perhaps because your getting vaccinated helps prevent the spread of the disease, or perhaps because your getting vaccinated helps persuade others to get vaccinated. In other words, while the costs and benefits to you matter, of course, so do the costs and benefits to other people, including other people who might be needed to take care of you if you get sick, or who might get infected by you. I just ad-lib by saying that I think when we heard the mantra earlier in the year, and we still hear it to some extent, that we should protect our NHS by washing hands, social distancing, et cetera. I think part of the protect the NHS was meant to be protect the people in the NHS from taking COVID into the hospital and thereby running the risk of getting them infected. So I think this second paragraph was invoked in that, or the idea in the second paragraph was behind that remark, or at least in part behind that remark. So now I have a little example, and the example is obviously in blue ink here. Suppose Natasha and I work in an office together, and actually Natasha's partner is highly vulnerable to COVID. And she could bring home COVID to her partner via working closely with me and catching it from me. Now, if that's true, then this fact provides very strong ethical reason for me to volunteer to get vaccinated, and for our employer to insist I be vaccinated if I don't volunteer. Mandatory vaccination will almost always be beneficial to the recipient, though he or she may not believe this, I think. And yet the main moral reason for requiring vaccination is the protection of other employees or customers or suppliers or the partners or parents or children of any of these people. So this is my final slide. For the government and various organizations to persuade and nudge people to get vaccinated rather than insist, I think, is ideal, unless too many people refuse. Now, some refusers would be people who just cannot believe the vaccine is safer than the disease. But I think other refusers would be people who accept the vaccine isn't dangerous to them, but think that they won't get the disease if others get vaccinated. And so they intend a free ride on the sacrifice of others if they can get away with it. Now, my friend Dan, I read an interesting paper by my friend Dan Dennis earlier in the week, and he focuses on people who don't believe that the vaccine is safer than the disease. And I think that's an important group. But I also think that this other group of potential free riders is an important group. Now, typically, the way to prevent free riding is to make contribution mandatory with enforcement backing up the requirement. I mean, that's the usual way of making free riding, just to discourage to the point of almost non-existent free riding. So now I consider a little spectrum, and the spectrum goes from weaker to stronger pressure. The weakest form of pressure, I don't say it need be very weak, but nevertheless, the weakest form of pressure, at least the ones I'm considering, is persuasion. So persuading people to get vaccinated. And maybe a bit stronger form of pressure is nudging, so persuading plus nudging. And then perhaps stronger than that would be for employers and businesses to require vaccination. And then stronger than that, I guess, would be for the law to insist on vaccination. Now, I'm proposing, you may disagree with me and persuade me otherwise, but I'm proposing that having organizations mandate vaccinations for their employees and customers will be enough, I think, and probably having nudges without mandates won't be enough. So my proposal is that from an ethical point of view, the best the best way forward is the requirement that employers and excuse me, the requirement that employers and businesses mandate vaccination for the protection not of the people who get the vaccination, but for the protection of other people they come into contact with, including fellow employees. Okay, so I look forward to your discussion, but in the meantime, we're going to hear much more interesting things from Emma, who's going to go next.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you to Gertrude and Ethical Reading for asking me to come and speak to you today. As Gertrude said, I'm an employment lawyer at Boyce Turner. We're a partner of Ethical Reading. We're primarily a tech sector firm, but also we act for clients in leisure and hospitality and also the automotive sector as well. So we have a broad spectrum of clients. And we also support our colleagues in corporate protection who do work a lot with care providers. So we've been asked a lot about this area. What I will say is, before I start, is that obviously this is really fast moving and also an untested area. So I can't point to any cases, I'm afraid, as lawyers often like to do. I will also say that this is just an overview of the core issues and some key considerations as I see it, and what I'm reading and sensing and picking up from our clients. Every sector, every employer, every business is different. So please do take your own specific advice, and certainly what I'm going to tell you today is no substitute for taking your own advice. Again, timely. Obviously, we had the announcement earlier this morning of the next phase of the vaccine rollout programme. So very timely and topical. So well done, Ethical Reading, for looking into the crystal ball. So what are the issues that I'm going to have a look at today? Well, if we look at the next slide, I want to look at really this idea of the issues around voluntary and obviously mandatory vaccines. I also want to have a look at some of the health and safety issues as well. I want to consider some of the legal risks and the legal areas, particularly looking at, as Brad's mentioned, around people who are unable to take the vaccine for whatever reason. But I also think, as well as this being a legal issue, I think there are people management issues as well, isn't it? And for some of you who have perhaps heard me speak before, I talk a lot about the type of business you want to be. Are you that destination employer? And does having a blanket policy, what does that say about you as an employer and that relationship that you want to have with your people? There's also a cost issue, isn't there, with all of this? At the moment, we know the vaccine is free, but at some point, potentially this vaccine may be commercially available. So at what point then is there a cost issue for employers as well? I think before we talk about what may or may not happen, as I said, this is incredibly fast moving. I think it's important to look at obviously what happens now. And if we look at the next slide, many of your people may actually be involved in jobs where they are required to have some form of vaccination. Particularly those that travel for business may well be asked to, or may well have some sort of obligation in which to have vaccinations for the purposes of work. We have, for example, clients that work within the NHS, and to work within the NHS there are recommendations that those individuals will have some level of vaccination. So you might get third parties requiring individuals to have certain vaccinations. Certainly we're looking at more of a voluntary than a mandatory obligation. We also have the basic premise as well that within our legal system, individuals are not forced to have compulsory treatment, and that would include vaccinations. Yes, of course, we do see some situations where the courts may intervene, but certainly that is the basic position. So I think in terms of where we are now, certainly, yes, there will be some requirements, particularly where individuals travel and particularly where they are involved in certain sectors. But I think we're very much looking at this as a sort of a voluntary and unwritten rule. Yes, if I want to travel, I must take vaccinations. I think there is a health and safety issue that we must have a look at. And certainly, again, Margaret, if you can move forward for me, please, that would be great. Thank you. Employers are under an obligation to take reasonable steps. Again, reasonable steps, there is no absolute, to reduce the risks to their workforce, to their customers, to their clients, to their visitors. And that's set out in the Health and Safety at Work Act, as well as other regulations as well. So that's the basic principle. Our health and safety rules are a two-way process. Employers will have policies and rules and regulations that employees will be expected to follow. So employees are expected to take steps to protect their own health and safety as well. And what we see at the moment is this baseline health and safety protection. And then on top of that, we see the COVID secure measures. And these have been very much brought out on a sector specific basis. There's government guidance. I believe there are 8 sectors that have been identified that have specific COVID measures. And I very much expect, as we have seen with schools, that we will see an increase in those as we begin to move forward and open up those sectors. So basic level of protection, and then obviously we have the COVID secure measures on top of that. And I think it's important to remember that even though we talk about vaccinations for COVID-19, they do not negate the health and safety obligations of employers, nor do they take away from the need to comply with the COVID secure obligations as well. And I think that's really important to remember. We also have seen, and the government have introduced, a testing programme. At the moment, we have over 100 employers, and we've got about 500 sites dotted around the country where employers have signed up, and their people, particularly those with those client-facing or public-facing roles, are going to be tested. So we've seen that as well. And of course, we've seen the government's own vaccination programme, where we have seen that whilst we have priority groups that have been prioritised, certainly at the moment the government are not proposing that the vaccination is mandatory. So turning to the particular issue of no jab, no job, as it seems to have been sort of discussed in the media. What are the risks and what are the considerations for employers? Well, when we think about this idea of a blanket policy, what we're looking at is, in legal terms, a policy, a criteria or a practice known as a PCP, which is applied across the workforce. But for many reasons, some of your people may not be able to comply with that, and they may not be able to comply with that because they fit into what's called a protected group. They have a protected characteristic. So, for example, age has been given as one of those protected groups. So, for example, our younger population at the moment are unable to comply with that PCP, and obviously, if there is this blanket policy of no jab, no job, they will be treated to their disadvantage for not being able to comply with that requirement. And that is known within discrimination law as indirect discrimination. It's not direct discrimination, it's indirect discrimination. Other examples of those protected characteristics, when we look at no jab, no job, would be potentially pregnant women who are advised not to take the jab unless absolutely necessary, and also potentially those groups who would fall within religious beliefs and maybe philosophical beliefs as well. Now, unlike direct discrimination, employers are able to objectively justify indirect discrimination. So what do we mean by that? Well, basically, it's an employer saying we have a legitimate reason for doing what we're doing. So our legitimate reason is we want to prevent the spread of COVID-19. And we don't think that those COVID secure measures or the general health and safety principles are enough to basically do what we want to do, our purpose. And so we say that we have a legitimate reason, we have an objective justification, and we can't achieve our aim in any other way. And that's really what employers, that's their defence, if you like, to a claim for indirect discrimination. And I think that threshold is going to be quite high, particularly for employers in the majority of sectors. I think the other issue is around what are we going to do with those individuals who do refuse? And certainly here we're looking at unfair dismissal protection for those individuals who have 2 years service. But of course, as we know, there is automatic unfair protection as well. There's a human rights angle here that we need to think about. And I also think that we need to think perhaps about personal injury as well. And if an employer is specifically requiring vaccination, could there be a personal injury angle to all of this? And will employers be able to get insurance for requiring their individuals to be vaccinated? I think there's data protection, huge data protection issues here. Any information with regards to your people's vaccination, their medical history, their testing information is all sensitive personal data within our data protection rules. So what are we going to do with that data? How are we going to protect it? Who needs to see that data? Why do we need to see that data? And what consent are we going to need? And I don't think our general consents under our privacy notices are going to be enough in this situation. So again, what do we do if our people, if they're not consenting to this? When we talk about claims, you know, whether it's unfair dismissal, whether we talk about discrimination claims, this is all, you know, expensive in terms of time, in terms of potential compensation, and in terms of potential legal fees as well. So there are some real serious, I think, legal issues that employers need to weigh up and consider. But I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all approach to this. And I can see that there is potential for some sectors to maybe get over that threshold of, you know, we can't achieve what we want to achieve if we just follow the COVID secure obligations and the health and safety obligations. And I think if we look at the next slide, you know, I think we are looking potentially there at those individuals who are working within the care sector. I think those in the medical profession, and as we've heard, the GMC are proposing to discipline doctors who refuse to take who refuse to have the vaccination. We've also heard as well that Care UK are proposing to introduce a policy for new employees, and also I read today as well that another care home provider again is looking to introduce this blanket policy and disciplinary action. So I think that whilst there are still some hurdles for employers to get over in those sectors, and I think here you're really looking at what is the purpose, why are we proposing to do this, and why do we say that we can't use testing, we can't use the COVID secure measures, and why we say as an employer, having undertaken all of our risk assessments, why we think that this is the only way that we can achieve that legitimate aim. I think there is an issue around new joiners. We heard the Justice Secretary say that he believes that new joiners potentially can be allowed to do this, and certainly I think Pimlico plumbers are proposing to do that for their workforce. But I think, you know, we need to be careful, because whilst, you know, we might be thinking, okay, new joiners, we don't have an unfair dismissal risk. Discrimination law is a day one right, and even a before somebody joins us right. So again, if we are not recruiting individuals because they cannot or refuse to have the vaccination and they fall into one of those protected groups, then even if they haven't joined us, they still have those discrimination protections as well. And I think also we need to think about automatic rights to bring claims for unfair dismissal, particularly again if we don't recruit somebody who's pregnant. Again, that's an automatic right. You don't need 2 years service. And I think the other thing to think about when we think about having this, you know, for new starters and maybe not for our current staff, do we end up in this two-tier workforce situation? How are we going to handle that logistically? How is that going to work on the ground, where we have some staff that are vaccinated and some staff that aren't? And so I think there's some real issues there for employers. And I do think, you know, following on from Brad's point about do we really need all of our staff to be vaccinated? Again, are we looking at those that have that client-facing role, have that working with the vulnerable? Do we need to really vaccinate everybody if that is found to be the only way to achieve our legitimate aim? No, this isn't a one-size-fits-all at all. And I think there might be a case, certainly for some sectors, to be looking at this potentially on a short-term basis, because again, how long is this going to go on for? Are we going to be having to have these vaccines year after year? But I think, again, if we look at the next slide, I think really we need to be focusing on this on a sort of a holistic approach, and thinking about what do we want to achieve and how can we do this, having a measured and balanced approach, perhaps looking at things on an individual basis, so individual employers, individual sectors, as well as in your individual people as well, and talking to them. I think looking at this as part of perhaps a package where we are looking at, educating people, encouraging people to take up the vaccine if they so wish. I think looking at things in terms of giving individuals time off work to be able to go and be vaccinated. I also wonder whether looking at perhaps our sick pay and perhaps encouraging employees to isolate potentially if they've been tested. I think looking at achieving what we want to achieve in other ways. But again, as I've said, it is a balanced approach. And I think we have to look at this on a case-by-case basis, weighing up those risks against the benefits. And I also think we have to wait and see what the government do as well. I rather suspect they won't do anything. And I think what they will do is leave it for the courts to decide. So they will leave it for individuals to bring, as I've said, either unfair dismissal claims or indirect discrimination claims. And I think they will leave it for the courts to decide whether that employer in that particular sector was indeed justified in having that policy. So those are the sorts of issues that I can see being thrown up by this policy, and I'm sure that other businesses will be thinking about other issues as well. But I do think it's a balance between the legal risks and also how we are going to support our people moving forward. So I do see it as a balance.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much, Emma. And there you have sort of contact information for further information if you want to get in touch with Emma as well, and we'll provide that. If you can provide that through the chat window as well, Margaret, that'd be great. So we do have some wonderful questions that our attendees have sent through the Q&A window. So perhaps let's kick off with, actually there's one for you, Emma. It's by Edward Fitzgerald, and he's written, we have decided to write the equivalent ethical statement to our anti-slavery policy with regards to human rights and vaccinations, in that we will not mandate our current or future employees to take any vaccinations. We will not contract with any organization that does mandate vaccinations. This would include both supply chain and clients. Our insurers have not designated COVID-19 or its variants as a life-threatening contagious disease, and therefore we believe that this is the correct policy. Emma, would you see any legal challenges to this approach?
Ed, good question. I would need to know what sector you're working in. All businesses are different. I think what I would say is watch the space. It certainly is a bold move. I'm not aware of any other employers that have done the same. I think that, as I said, I think we just need to watch this space. And I think with everything that we've seen over the last year is rule nothing in, nothing out, and keep everything under review.
Probably another one for you that's just come in, Emma. What about the sight of a likely vaccination passport as a recruitment interview condition?
Yeah, good question. I think, again, we will have to wait and see. I know Michael Gove is reviewing this at the moment from a sort of a government level. I think recruitment's an interesting one, isn't it? Because, you know, we do have to balance, again, that point about, you know, there's one school of thought that says, look, ask whatever question you like, but it depends what you do with the answer. And again, it does not, you know, if you ask everybody that you interview, okay, do you have vaccine passport or have you had the vaccine? I think then you're looking at, okay, well, all right, I've asked the same question of everybody. So we go back to our, you know, criteria practice. But then, you know, if it's pretty obvious that every time you ask that, you don't recruit, for example, the 18-year-old, or you don't recruit the pregnant woman, or I don't know, I'm just, you know, sort of trying to think off the top of my head, then it begins to look, you know, you're running into difficulties, aren't you, as an organisation? We go back to that point, don't we, where we look at indirect discrimination, and it's really about being able to think about what is the purpose, what are we trying to achieve by having this policy, and then working through the risks in terms of, can we achieve that policy in any less discriminatory way? And, you know, it's really going to depend on the business, it's going to depend on evidence, it's going to depend on our risk assessments. But I think that to ask that question, you need to be really clear about what you're going to do with the answer and how that is going to be perceived. Because, you know, discrimination cases are not about having that killer email that says, don't recruit, you know, don't recruit Sally because she's not had the COVID jab. It's all about inference. And as I said, if you're asking the same question of everybody, and every time you recruit, you know, the person who has, and they're in the same age group or the same ethnic group or whatever it might be, then you are potentially creating issues for yourself.
Cool. I've got a couple of questions now for Brad. So Brad, Charlotte Newey raises an interesting point. Thank you for the presentation, Brad. If you are right that nudging isn't going to be effective enough, then since many people are in employment, they could be self-employed, unemployed or retired, might we need some legal pressure to force unwilling people in these categories to be vaccinated, or is it okay for them to free ride on the employed?
That is a good question. That is a good question. I don't know the answer. It is a good question, and I don't know the answer. I guess off the top of my head, it would depend on what the percentage is of people who don't have an employer, who don't have an employer. So presumably they're doing something to get an income, but without an employer. Perhaps they're the boss of their own. They're an employer, but they don't have an employer. I don't know. You know, one person workforce. And then I guess, and then taking a leaf out of Emma's book, I guess it would also depend on the industry the person was in. So if the person was just as an example, if the person was a sculptor and sculpted at home all the time, and then washed the sculptures and sent them off, but never actually came into contact with other people, I can't quite see why this person would be right to mandate this person get a vaccination. But if it was somebody who was without an employer, but regularly came into contact with clients and customers and suppliers, et cetera, physical contact, then there would be more pressure. But I don't have a pat answer. I think it's a good question.
It's a great question, isn't it? Because the retired segment is a huge segment, relatively. you know, if you look at the demographics of the UK, I don't know what percentage of population it is, but I would hazard a guess it's actually quite significant. And so if there's no legal pressure for them, of course, they're by definition retired, so not working anywhere, so there's no mandation or mandating by an employer, and it's purely immoral.
Well, in that situation, it would have to come from Parliament. There would have to be, that, you know, you would have to make it legal that everybody in the country has this vaccine, which we don't have at the moment. Actually, we have the opposite. And I think that, you know, again, then you're sort of, well, why this vaccine and not something else? You know, I'm thinking about kind of, you know, childhood immunizations as well. So I think it's you know, it's kind of beyond the realms of sort of law, almost. It's sort of, you know, what does society want? And I think that if you are going to do that, I think you're going to have a real shift. You'll have to have it legislated.
And that's interesting. So it sounds as though the government is taking then a sort of wait and see approach in terms of, you know.
Well, they've said that it isn't mandatory even for priority groups, which is, you know, quite interesting.
Interesting. So we've got some more questions here. What are the moral implications of only allowing the vaccinated members of the workforce to return to face-to-face working, with the rest restricted to remote working for a longer time?
Is that whom are you addressing it to? Me?
Well, either one.
Okay.
Probably more in your court, Brad.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, look. It is true that if you mandate vaccinations, or even if you don't mandate them, even if you just have a lot of social pressure, which does not quite close to mandate. Anyway, if we have a regime in which vaccinations are either mandatory or there's immense social pressure on them, that is going to disadvantage some people. In particular, the people who refuse to get them. There's no doubt about it. The question is whether that disadvantage to those people is justified for the sake of protecting other people. And I take Emma's point that there needn't be a one-size-fits-all answer to that question. But that's I mean, I'm not denying that mandatory vaccinations are going to be disadvantageous to some people. They will. I accept they will be. But I think it's justified, at least in some cases, for the sake of protecting other people.
And there's a couple more interesting. I mean, there are lots of interesting questions coming through now, which is fantastic. So there is Sean Lundy asks a question. Do you feel, probably in your court, Emma, do you feel that ethical employers have an obligation to actively debunk myths on COVID and vaccinations in the interests of other H&S and in complying with H&S legal duties?
I can't really answer that if they have an ethical obligation. I think as part of sort of, you could have it as part of sort of an education program, as sort of we do now for sort of well-being and wellness and mental and physical health. You know, we sort of try and support our people and point them in the direction of where they can find more help and support. I can't really answer that from an ethical perspective, but I can certainly say that employers will have, they will signpost their employees into finding out more information about something, and I can see that being a sensible way of moving forward. I hope that answers the question. Sorry. Mm-hmm.
And we've got so the last one. There's lots of questions. It's an interesting one from Peter Keelan, and Peter is not yet vaccinated. Peter says, "I am in a team of 100 people, and I am the only one not vaccinated. The chances of me giving the virus to one of the 99 is very limited. If none of us had been vaccinated, the chances of me giving the virus to another team member is at its highest level of risk. What percentage of the 100 people need to be vaccinated before it's ethically justified for me to refuse the vaccine on the basis that an acceptable proportion of people are safe and the chances of the remaining getting it is reduced to an acceptable level? Is there an ethically acceptable level of percentage at all? There's probably one.
I think it's an epidemiology question, actually.
It sounds a bit like that. I just wondered if you had any thoughts or views on that one.
Well, I accept that it's a scientific question. What is the percent? When is the percentage low enough so that the risk of passing it on to other people is sufficiently low? So that, but as the tone of the theme of my remarks was, protecting against free riders is a legitimate reason for restricting behavior and mandating things. And there is a big danger of free riding in this case. I'm sorry, not just this case, but I mean the whole COVID problem. So I'm for vaccinating 100% of people.
Right, so that's clear.
Let me just add, it's not just the co-workers, of course, it's the other, it's also the clients, customers, So presumably this business is not just those 100 people talking to each other or dealing with each other, but dealing with other people as well.
Great. Another question, which is, again, I think probably more for you, Brad, which is, what would you say to those people who are adamant that vaccination does not prevent contamination by vaccinated individuals from a moral viewpoint? What would you say to them?
I'm not a scientist, biologist, medical person, so I don't know whether this claim is true or not. If it is true that a unvaccinated person cannot contaminate anybody else via, like in my case of Natasha, if Natasha had already been vaccinated, but her partner is very vulnerable, and I don't get vaccinated, is there some danger that somehow I will, I don't know, touch Natasha, or she'll pick up a pencil or something of mine, and then via that pass it on to her partner? So that I take it that's the kind of worry. So I suppose I'm not vaccinated, Natasha is vaccinated, and her partner is unvaccinated and vulnerable, right? That's the sort of picture we've got. He's let's suppose he or she is too vaccinated to be vaccinated. Sorry, too vulnerable to be vaccinated, but is very vulnerable. Okay, so I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the scientific answer to that question. But if the answer is that there is some risk, then whether the person denies that there's that risk seems to me not terribly important. Sometimes people have to be forced to do things, even when they disagrey.
Brilliant. Let me just see if there's anything else. There's one question here, which is that this is about permanent home workers, probably one for you, Emma. So permanent home workers might be required to visit the office on a frequent or infrequent basis. If they are not vaccinated, they could still pose a risk.
Well, I'll go back to the answers that I gave, that it depends on the employer, the sector, and risk assessments, and basically deciding what the purpose is that we are trying to achieve, and why we say as an employer that the steps that are already in place under the Health and Safety at Work Act and the COVID secure measures and other health and safety regulations are not enough to do what we want to do. So it will all depend on the situation. And
brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Brad and Emma, for a very interesting dive into this very thorny topic, both from a moral perspective and from legal people perspective. And thank you very much for joining us today, our attendees. Some wonderful questions. And I think what you will have heard, hopefully, you will have gathered that this is by no means a clear-cut and easy issue and situation, and that there is a lot of areas where case-by-case analysis is required, particularly from a legal point of view, and quite often in these situations, as Emma was saying, we will see some of these things tested out in courts over the coming days and weeks. And hopefully the discussion today will have informed you a little bit better about some of these issues, so you can stay on top of what's being discussed. As I said, thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you again next time. All the best. Thank you very much, Emma and Brad.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.